What if one act of kindness changed your life forever? A struggling grocery store worker helps a single mother in need, unaware that Michael Jordan is watching. The next day, a mysterious invitation arrives. No name, just an address. What starts as a test turns into a high-stakes battle in the ruthless world of billionaires, power plays, and betrayals. Because in Michael Jordan's world, loyalty is priceless, and betrayal comes at a cost. Would you take the risk? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Share in the comments below. The hum of flickering fluorescent lights filled the small grocery store on Chicago's South Side. The evening rush had slowed, leaving only a few late shoppers moving through the aisles with weary steps. The air smelled of freshly mopped floors, faintly mingled with the scent of aging produce from the corner display. The atmosphere was quiet, almost heavy, as if the store itself carried the weight of the lives passing through it. Beckett Rhodes stood behind the checkout counter, absently scanning a pack of bottled water for a customer who barely looked up from her phone. He had worked here long enough to recognize faces: the exhausted parents stretching every dollar, the elderly regulars who wandered the aisles just for the company, and the occasional impatient businessman who looked at his watch more than the cashier. But tonight, his attention was drawn to a woman standing at register 4. She looked young, mid-30s at most, her blonde hair slightly disheveled, dark circles beneath her eyes. A little boy, no older than 4, clung to her coat, wide brown eyes darting between the candy rack and his mother's trembling hands. She was fumbling with her wallet, knuckles white as she gripped her credit card, her lips pressed into a thin, desperate line. The machine beeped sharply. Declined. The cashier, a tired-looking kid who had probably just started last week, cleared his throat awkwardly. Ma'am, it didn't go through. Maybe try again?" The woman swallowed hard, forcing a smile. I know I have enough," she mumbled, trying the card again. Another beep, another decline. The moment stretched uncomfortably, the woman shifting her weight from one foot to the other. She rummaged in her bag, pulling out a few crumpled bills and some coins, counting under her breath. The total was still short. The little boy looked up at her. "Mommy?" His voice was small, uncertain, a sharp inhale. The mother blinked fast, trying to keep the emotion from surfacing. "It's okay, sweetheart. Just give me a second." Beckett saw the defeat in her eyes. He had seen that look before, in his mother's face when she struggled to put food on the table after his dad walked out. It was the look of someone trying so damn hard to hold it together when everything was falling apart. Without a second thought, Beckett stepped away from his register, walking over to register 4. "I got it," he said, pulling out his wallet. The woman's head snapped up. "What?" Beckett shrugged, swiping his own card before she could protest. The machine beeped, this time confirming the purchase. The cashier looked at him, hesitant but saying nothing. The woman's eyes welled up. "You don't have to do that," she whispered. "I know," Beckett said simply, "but it looks like you've had a rough night." She stared at him for a moment as if trying to figure out if this was real. Then she exhaled, blinking rapidly before giving him a small, broken smile. "Thank you. Really." Beckett just nodded, handing her the bags. The little boy looked up at him, his tiny voice filled with curiosity. "Are you a superhero?" A short laugh escaped Beckett. "Nah, kid, just a guy who's been there." The woman squeezed his hand briefly, then hurried out of the store, her son clutching her side. Beckett watched them disappear through the sliding doors, the icy wind from outside swirling in for just a second before they were gone. And that's when he noticed him. A tall man in a dark baseball cap stood near the entrance, watching. Michael Jordan. The Michael Jordan. His face was partially shadowed under the cap, but there was no mistaking him. The sharp jawline, the confident stance, the quiet intensity in his eyes. He wasn't in a suit, wasn't surrounded by cameras or an entourage. Just a man in a hoodie and jeans, standing near a shelf of energy drinks, observing the entire exchange with an unreadable expression. Beckett's stomach tightened. Had he done something wrong? Jordan didn't move, didn't say a word, just held Beckett's gaze for a beat too long before finally turning, walking towards the exit with an easy, measured stride. The automatic doors slid open, and just like that, he was gone. Beckett let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. What the hell was that about? Outside, Michael Jordan stepped into the cold Chicago night, hands deep in his pockets. The winter air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. He had seen a lot of things in his life, on and off the court, the ruthless business deals, the fake smiles, the way people changed when money was on the table. He had learned to expect it, to anticipate it. But this kid, Beckett Rhodes, he wasn't playing for an audience. Jordan had watched the whole thing, the way Beckett had helped without hesitation, without expecting anything in return, the way he had seen a stranger struggling and just acted. It reminded him of something. No, someone. His father. James Jordan had always told him, "Money comes and goes, Mike. But your character? That's the one thing you take to the grave." Michael exhaled sharply, looking down the street. He could leave it at this. Just a quiet moment, another nameless good deed in a city filled with forgotten kindness. Or, Jordan pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. He had an idea. And Beckett Rhodes had no idea his life was about to change forever. Michael Jordan sat in the driver's seat of his black Escalade, parked just outside the grocery store, the engine humming quietly beneath him. The night had settled in, casting long shadows across the parking lot, but his mind was still inside that store, replaying what he had just witnessed. He had come in to pick up a bottle of water, nothing more. It was a rare night where he wasn't being pulled in 10 different directions. No meetings, no media appearances, no corporate handshakes. Just a quiet moment in the city that had made him a legend. But then he had seen Beckett Rhodes. Michael leaned back against the leather seat, fingers tapping absently against the steering wheel. There was something about the kid, not the action itself. Plenty of people had the capacity for kindness. But the way Beckett did it? Like it wasn't a decision at all. Like it was instinct. Michael's mind drifted back to his father, James Jordan, a man who had built his life on integrity, who had always told his son, "Character isn't what you show when the world is watching. It's who you are in the quiet moments." This moment, it had been quiet. No cameras, no applause. Just a broke grocery store worker reaching into his own wallet for someone else. Michael exhaled sharply. Over the years, he had grown used to seeing people operate with an agenda. In the boardroom, in business, even in friendships, everything was about leverage. He had made peace with it. But tonight, something unsettled him. His phone vibrated in the cup holder. A text from one of his assistants. "Meeting at 9 a.m. tomorrow with investors. Want me to push it?" He stared at the message, then flicked the screen off. Not tonight. Tonight, something else had caught his attention. He glanced back toward the grocery store entrance. Beckett was still inside, finishing up his shift. Michael's jaw tightened as an idea formed. A test. He wanted to see if what he had witnessed was real, or just a one-time gesture. He reached into the glove compartment, pulling out a small leather wallet. Inside, tucked between crisp $100 bills, was an old, tattered food voucher, a relic from a charity event he had sponsored years ago. The expiration date had long passed, but that wasn't the point. Michael pulled up his contacts, scrolling until he landed on a name, Edgar Price. Edgar had been his father's friend, a man who had worked the assembly lines for decades before retirement. He was pushing 80 now, but still sharp, and, more importantly, he was someone Michael trusted. Michael hit dial. The phone rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. "Didn't expect to hear from you this late, Mike." Michael smirked slightly. "I need a favor, old man." Inside the store, Beckett wiped down the conveyor belt at his register, his movements quick and practiced. His shift was almost over, and he was exhausted. His feet ached, and the clock moved slower than it had any right to. The door chimed as a new customer walked in. Beckett barely glanced up at first, but something about the man made him pause. Elderly, maybe late 70s, with a tired shuffle in his step. He wore an old flannel jacket that had seen better days, and his eyes darted around as if trying to find something specific. Beckett straightened up. "Evening, sir. Need help finding anything?" The man hesitated. Then, after a long moment, he made his way to the counter, pulling a single item from his pocket, a folded food voucher. "This still good?" The man, Edgar, asked, voice rough around the edges. Beckett took the paper, smoothing it out. His stomach dropped. The expiration date was 3 years ago. He glanced up. Edgar's face gave nothing away, but there was something in his expression, a quiet sort of embarrassment. Beckett knew that look. He had seen it before in people who had to ask for help when they didn't want to. Beckett could already hear the store's policies ringing in his head. Expired vouchers weren't accepted. He could call his manager, but he already knew how that conversation would go. He looked at the total. It wasn't much, just enough for a loaf of bread and a carton of eggs. Beckett didn't even think. He reached for his wallet. "It's fine," he said casually, pulling out a few bills. "I'll cover it." Edgar's eyes flickered with something. Surprise. "You sure?" "Yeah," Beckett said, ringing up the items. "Happens all the time. No big deal." Edgar nodded slowly, accepting the bag with a quiet, "Thank you." He turned to leave, moving toward the exit where a black Escalade was still parked outside. From his car, Michael watched everything. The moment Beckett reached for his wallet, a slow smirk crept across his face. It wasn't a fluke. Twice in one night Beckett had chosen to help. No hesitation, no second thoughts, just action. Michael leaned back in his seat, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel. He had built his entire empire on instinct, trusting it, following it, knowing when someone was different. Beckett Rhodes. He was different. But now came the real question. What was Michael going to do with him? The night air was crisp as Beckett Rhodes stepped out of the grocery store, rubbing his hands together for warmth. His shift had dragged, but at least it was over. The neon glow of the store's sign flickered above him as he walked toward his bike, chained to the rusted railing near the entrance. He reached for the lock, but his hand stopped midair. A black envelope was tucked under his handlebars. Sleek. Heavy cardstock. No address, no markings. Just his name scrawled in elegant, unfamiliar handwriting. Beckett frowned, glancing around the parking lot. The place was nearly empty now, just a few lingering cars and the soft hum of streetlights buzzing overhead. His stomach tensed. This wasn't normal. Carefully, he pulled the envelope free, slipping a finger under the seal. Inside was a single white card with embossed lettering. Come to 1460 Lakeshore Drive at 8 p.m. Don't be late, no signature, no explanation. Beckett's pulse kicked up a notch. He knew Lakeshore Drive. Chicago's elite lived there. The billionaires, the power brokers, the kind of people who wouldn't know a grocery store worker if he was standing right in front of them. This had to be a mistake. A prank. But as he turned the card over, something on the back caught his eye. A symbol, subtle, barely visible under the dim light, a small engraved Jumpman logo. Michael Jordan. Beckett's mind reeled. Why? How? The man had been in the store, sure, but what did that mean? He couldn't seriously expect Beckett to show up at some high-rise address with no explanation. He slid the card back into the envelope, exhaling slowly. His first instinct was to toss it. Ignore it. Go home. Forget it ever happened. But something deep in his gut told him otherwise. Beckett sat on his battered couch, staring at the card on his coffee table. 7:45 p.m. He had exactly 15 minutes to decide. He drummed his fingers against his knee, chewing the inside of his cheek. Every logical part of his brain told him to let it go. This wasn't his world. He had no business stepping into it. But another part, The part that had always longed for something more whispered that this was a door he might never get another chance to walk through. With a frustrated sigh, he grabbed his jacket and keys. Screw it. The ride through the city was surreal. Beckett weaved through traffic, his fingers tightening on the handlebars as towering glass buildings loomed above him. When he finally reached 1460 Lakeshore Drive, his stomach clenched. The building was a fortress. A sleek, ultra-modern high-rise, its black mirrored exterior reflecting the streetlights. A valet waited out front, standing near a line of expensive cars, Bentleys, Aston Martins, machines that cost more than Beckett would make in a lifetime. He locked his bike to a street sign. It looked ridiculous sitting next to a Rolls-Royce. Taking a deep breath, he stepped toward the entrance. A man in a dark suit was already watching him. No name tag, no expression, just an earpiece and a sharp gaze that assessed Beckett in a single sweep. "You're expected," the man said, pushing open the heavy glass door without another word. Beckett hesitated before stepping inside. The lobby was unlike anything he had ever seen. Marble floors, a scent that smelled expensive but impossible to place, silence so thick it felt unnatural. A second man appeared, just as sharply dressed. "Mr. Jordan is waiting upstairs." Beckett's heart thumped. He followed without a word. The elevator ride felt eternal. By the time the doors slid open, his palms were damp. The hallway was dimly lit, leading to a single set of massive black doors. The suited man motioned toward them before stepping aside. Beckett swallowed hard. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he pushed the doors open. The room was nothing like he expected. It wasn't an office, not a boardroom. It was a penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city, skyline, lights glittering like scattered diamonds. A fireplace crackled in the corner, casting long shadows. The furniture was sleek but understated, modern but not gaudy. And then there was him. Michael Jordan stood near the window, his back to Beckett. He held a glass of something dark, swirling it absently before taking a slow sip. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without turning, Jordan finally broke the silence. "You're late." Beckett's breath hitched. He checked his watch. 7:59 p.m. "I don't think I am," he said cautiously. Michael turned then, his gaze landing on Beckett like a physical weight. The man was imposing. Not just in height, but in presence. There was something about him, an energy that filled the room without effort. Beckett swallowed. "Why am I here?" Jordan studied him for a long moment, then gestured toward a leather chair. "Sit." Beckett hesitated before stepping forward, lowering himself into the chair. Jordan took his own seat across from him, setting his glass down. "You're here because I watched you do something most people wouldn't." Beckett tensed. "You mean at the store?" Michael nodded. "You didn't know I was watching, but you helped anyway." His expression was unreadable. "Why?" Beckett blinked. "Because someone needed help. That simple." Beckett exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I guess it is. I don't see the point in standing around when you can actually do something." Michael leaned back, folding his hands together. He liked that answer. "There's a lot of people in this city, Beckett," he said. "Most of them look out for themselves, even the ones who claim they don't." Beckett stayed silent. Michael tilted his head slightly. "You remind me of someone." Beckett frowned. "Who?" Michael's gaze darkened slightly. "My father." The weight of those words settled heavily between them. Beckett shifted. "I still don't get it. What does any of this have to do with me?" Jordan smirked, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small black keycard and set it on the table between them. "Consider this a test," he said. "Tomorrow morning, come back here. 8 a.m. No questions, no excuses." Beckett stared at the keycard, then back at Michael. "And if I don't?" Michael held his gaze. "Then you walk away." He shrugged. "And you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what this was." Beckett's pulse pounded in his ears. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure. He was coming back. The elevator hummed softly as it ascended, the numbers above the door blinking one by one. Beckett Rhodes shifted his weight, his fingers tightening around the keycard Michael Jordan had given him the night before. His mind was still reeling. He should have walked away. A normal person would have tossed that card in the trash, chalked it up to some billionaire's mind game. But here he was. The doors slid open to reveal a long, dimly lit hallway, its walls lined with modern artwork Beckett couldn't even begin to interpret. The floor-to-ceiling windows at the end of the corridor framed the city skyline, the Chicago lights stretching endlessly into the horizon. For a second, he hesitated. What the hell was he doing here? Before he could second-guess himself, a voice cut through the quiet. "Come in." Beckett turned to see an open door leading into a massive penthouse. The space was sleek and minimalistic. Black leather furniture, dark wooden floors, and a single mahogany desk near the windows. At that desk sat Michael Jordan, leaning back in his chair, fingers steepled together as he studied Beckett with an unreadable expression. The air felt heavier inside, thick with something Beckett couldn't quite place. It wasn't intimidation. It was expectation. Slowly, Beckett stepped in, letting the door shut behind him. Jordan nodded toward the chair across from him. "Sit." Beckett hesitated for half a second before doing as he was told. Michael leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. His gaze was sharp, calculated as if he were sizing Beckett up, breaking him down piece by piece. "You don't know who I am." Beckett exhaled. "Of course I do, but that doesn't explain why I'm here." Michael smirked slightly. "Fair enough." For a long moment he didn't say anything, just watched, like he was waiting for something. Beckett forced himself to hold the man's gaze, even though his stomach tightened under the weight of it. Then, finally, Jordan spoke. "You helped 2 people yesterday." His voice was low, measured. "And you didn't have to." Beckett tensed. He should have known this was about the grocery store. Michael tilted his head slightly. "You could have looked the other way, could have ignored that woman, could have followed policy and turned the old man down. But you didn't." Beckett shifted in his seat. "Is that a bad thing?" Jordan let out a quiet chuckle. "Not at all. It's just rare." A beat of silence. Then Michael did something Beckett didn't expect. He laughed. Not a full, booming laugh, but a short, genuine one, like something had genuinely amused him. "I like you, kid." He leaned back in his chair. "I like people who don't hesitate to do what's right, even when no one's watching." Beckett didn't respond. He wasn't sure where this was going, and that made him uneasy. Michael reached into his desk drawer, pulling out a small folder. He slid it across the desk toward Beckett. "I have an offer for you." Beckett hesitated before picking it up. When he flipped it open, his breath hitched slightly. "A contract." Michael's voice was smooth, controlled. "A test run. No guarantees, no promises. But if you're willing, I want you to work for me." Beckett frowned, flipping through the pages. The job title wasn't listed, just vague descriptions about business operations and confidential responsibilities. "This doesn't tell me much," Beckett muttered. Michael smirked. "That's the point." Beckett looked up. "What exactly would I be doing?" Jordan exhaled through his nose. "I have people around me, advisors, investors, businessmen, but most of them tell me what I want to hear." He gestured toward Beckett. You're different. I want to see if you can handle a world where integrity doesn't always come first." Beckett's pulse quickened. "You think I belong in that world?" Michael's expression turned serious. "That's what we're going to find out." Another beat of silence. The weight of the moment settled heavily between them. Beckett's instincts screamed at him to walk away. This was too big, too fast. He had spent his life in grocery stores, living paycheck to paycheck. Now a billionaire was offering him a shot at something unimaginable. But then he thought of his mother, of the nights she had worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. He thought of all the doors that had never opened for people like him. Maybe this was his one chance. Finally, Beckett set the contract down. His voice was steady when he spoke. "I'm in." A slow, approving nod from Michael. "Good." Beckett had no idea what he had just signed up for, but something in Michael's eyes told him one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. Beckett Rhodes had never seen wealth like this. His world had always been small. Grocery store aisles, cramped apartments, and the kind of jobs where you punched in, punched out, and barely scraped by. Now, he was stepping into a universe where money didn't just buy comfort. It dictated power, controlled rooms, and decided who mattered. From the moment he accepted Michael Jordan's offer, his life shifted at an unforgiving pace. One day, he was scanning barcodes behind a register, and the next, he was standing in the skylit offices of Jordan Enterprises, surrounded by men in tailored suits who could smell an outsider from a mile away. Beckett knew how to work hard. What he didn't know was how to play by rules that were never meant for people like him. Michael had given him an office, not because he needed one, but because perception mattered in this world. "They need to see you as one of us," Michael had told him, "even if they don't believe it yet." That "they" quickly made themselves known. William Reese, a name that carried weight in every corporate boardroom, in every private investment meeting, in every deal Michael Jordan made. A man who had been at Michael's side for decades, advising him, protecting his empire. And he hated Beckett from the moment he laid eyes on him. The first time they met, it was at a private gala in a downtown Chicago skyscraper, the kind of event where the wine flowed endlessly, the conversations were rehearsed, and every handshake was a silent transaction. Beckett had never felt more out of place. Michael had told him to observe, not speak. "Watch how they move. Learn what they don't say out loud," he had advised. But William Reese had other plans. He found Beckett standing alone near the balcony, watching the city instead of the crowd. Reese stepped up beside him, drink in hand, and gave a casual, predatory smile. "You're just a grocery boy." Beckett stiffened. He turned his head slightly, meeting Reese's gaze. The man looked relaxed, amused even, but there was an unmistakable edge in his voice. Reese took a slow sip of his drink. "Men like us don't lose to men like you." Beckett clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay still. "Men like us?" he repeated. "Didn't realize I was playing the same game." "You're not," Reese said smoothly. "That's the point." Beckett let out a slow breath. He had dealt with arrogant rich men before, the kind who walked into the store and acted like they owned the air you breathed. But this was different. This was personal. Reese leaned in just slightly. "You think Michael brought you here because you're special?" He chuckled. "You're a distraction, a project, a reminder of whatever moral high ground he still thinks he has." His smirk widened. "And projects? They get discarded when they stop being useful." Beckett didn't flinch. He held Reese's gaze, refusing to be the first to look away. After a moment, Reese sighed, finishing his drink. "Enjoy the night, kid." He clapped Beckett on the back, harder than necessary, and walked away, already blending back into the crowd. Beckett exhaled slowly. He had never been more aware of how much he didn't belong. Michael found him later that night standing at the bar, turning a glass of whiskey in his hand, but not drinking it. "You met Reese." It wasn't a question. Beckett nodded. "He doesn't like me." Michael smirked. "No, he doesn't." A beat of silence. Then Michael's expression shifted, serious, controlled. "They'll come for you," he said quietly, "the moment they think you matter." Beckett frowned. "What does that mean?" Michael set his drink down. "It means that in this world, people like Reese don't attack unless they see you as a threat." Beckett scoffed. "I've been here 5 minutes. How the hell am I a threat?" Michael held his gaze. "Because I made you one." For the first time, it truly hit Beckett. Michael hadn't just given him a job, He had put him in the line of fire. Michael saw the realization settle in Beckett's eyes and nodded. This world isn't kind. It rewards power and buries weakness. If you want to survive, you don't just fight back. You outthink them. Beckett swallowed hard, setting his untouched whiskey down. And if I don't? Michael's jaw tightened. Then you become exactly what they expect you to be. Another nobody they can forget. The weight of the words settled heavily between them. Beckett wasn't sure what kind of war he had just stepped into. But one thing was clear. Walking away was no longer an option. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of silence. Beckett Rhodes had learned to recognize the rhythms of Jordan Enterprises, the unspoken rules, the politics that moved faster than the numbers on a stock ticker. But today, the office felt different. Conversations hushed when he walked by. Side glances lingered just a little too long. The usual confident nods from staff were replaced by uncertainty, like they were waiting for him to crumble. Then his access badge stopped working. Beckett swiped it again at the elevator. Nothing. His stomach clenched. He turned toward Michael Jordan's assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Diane, who had always treated him with a quiet, professional respect. But today, she wouldn't meet his eyes. "Michael wants to see you. Now." Her voice was clipped, devoid of warmth. Beckett swallowed hard. Something was very, very wrong. The moment he stepped into Michael's office, the tension hit him like a freight train. Michael Jordan stood by the window, his back turned, staring out over the city like he was trying to decide if it was worth burning down. The air inside the room was thick, suffocating, charged with something Beckett couldn't place. But it wasn't anger. Not yet. Then Michael spoke, his voice low, controlled. Too controlled. "Tell me you didn't do it." Beckett's pulse kicked up. "Do what?" Michael turned, slowly, eyes unreadable. He tossed a folder onto the desk between them. "You tell me." Beckett hesitated before stepping forward. The folder was already open, its contents staring up at him. Confidential financial documents. And at the bottom of each leaked page, Beckett's digital signature. The room tilted. His breath caught in his chest. This isn't real. Michael folded his arms. He wasn't raising his voice. He didn't have to. The weight of his silence was enough. "These documents," Michael said, his voice unnervingly calm, "were leaked to an outside firm, a competitor. They're claiming we engaged in fraudulent reporting. If this sticks, Beckett, it'll cost me millions." Beckett felt the blood drain from his face. "You think I—" He stopped himself, inhaling sharply. "Michael, I didn't do this." Michael's expression didn't change. He was waiting, watching. Beckett's fists clenched. "If you think I did, fire me." The words hung between them like a dare. Michael didn't move, didn't blink. Something in his eyes flickered. Doubt? Or something else entirely? "You expect me to believe this is a setup?" Michael asked. Beckett met his gaze, unflinching. "I expect you to trust me." Silence. Michael exhaled through his nose, turning back toward the window. For the first time since Beckett walked in, Michael looked tired. Finally, he spoke. "Diane will handle your suspension. Until I figure out what the hell is going on, you're out." Beckett felt like he had been punched in the gut. He wanted to fight, to push back, to demand that Michael believe him. But the look on Michael's face told him this wasn't just about facts. This was about control. And right now, Michael had none. The office doors shut behind him, and the whispers followed. Beckett walked out of the building like a man heading toward the executioner's block. Suspended. The word echoed in his mind as he reached the street, his breath misting in the cold. Air dot. He should have been furious, should have been storming back in there demanding Michael open his eyes, but instead, there was only one thought in his head. Who set him up? Beckett knew one thing for certain. This wasn't an accident. Michael Jordan sat in his office long after Beckett had left. He hadn't wanted to suspend him. Hell, a part of him didn't even believe Beckett had done it. But the stakes were too high, and if Michael had learned anything in business, it was this. When a storm hits, you don't stand in the rain. You move. You control the narrative. But something wasn't adding up. Michael turned back to the leaked documents. Too perfect, too clean. And Beckett? He wasn't clean. He was reckless, emotional, stubborn as hell. If Beckett had decided to betray him, he wouldn't have done it with surgical precision. He would have left a mess. Which meant... Michael picked up his phone. "Diane," he said the moment she answered. "I want a list of everyone who had access to those files. And I want it now." Someone was playing a dangerous game. And Michael Jordan didn't lose. Michael Jordan wasn't a man who jumped to conclusions. He had built his empire with patience, precision, and an instinct so sharp it had turned him from a basketball legend into a business titan. He didn't just play the game. He controlled it. And right now, something wasn't adding up. The documents had been leaked. The blame had landed on Beckett Rhodes. Too easily. Too cleanly. Michael knew Beckett. The kid was blunt, impulsive, emotionally driven. But he wasn't calculated. If he had planned a betrayal, it wouldn't have been this polished, which meant someone else had orchestrated it. And Michael had a damn good idea who. Diane was efficient. She had been with Michael long enough to understand how he worked. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. She didn't waste time. So, when he had called her and asked for a list of everyone who had accessed those documents in the last month, she had the report in his hands within the hour. Michael sat in his penthouse, a glass of bourbon untouched beside him as he scanned the report. Names, timestamps, access points, and there it was. William Reese. Michael's jaw tightened as he stared at the name. He had suspected it, but seeing the proof laid out in front of him made his blood run cold. Reese had been with him for years, had sat in meetings, negotiated deals, advised him on decisions that had made Jordan Enterprises the powerhouse it was. But loyalty in this world was a currency, and Reese had just sold his to someone else. Michael exhaled slowly. He wouldn't confront Reese now. That was too easy, too predictable. Instead, he'd do what he did best. He'd set the trap. Beckett Rhodes sat in his apartment, staring at the half-packed duffel bag on his bed. It wasn't much, just a few clothes, some books, and the black envelope that had first led him to Michael Jordan's world. He didn't know why he had kept it. Maybe because it was proof that, for a moment, someone had seen potential in him. And now, it was over. Michael hadn't outright said it, but Beckett knew how this world worked. You don't get suspended and come back from it. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration curling in his chest. He hadn't done anything. He had spent his whole life trying to prove he was more than the circumstances he came from, more than just a grocery store worker with no future. And the second he had something real, something bigger, it had been ripped away from him. Maybe Reese was right. Maybe men like Beckett didn't belong in this world. A sharp knock at the door made him jolt. He frowned, glancing at the clock. 11:42 p.m. No one came by this late. When he opened the door, he nearly lost his breath. Michael Jordan stood there, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Beckett straightened. "If you're here to make it official, don't bother. I already know I'm out." Michael didn't respond right away. His eyes flicked to the half-packed bag on the bed, then back to Beckett. "That's what you think?" Beckett let out a short laugh. "Come on, man. We both know how this works." Michael stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. "No, we don't." Beckett frowned. Something about Michael's tone was different. It wasn't cold, wasn't angry. It was calculating. Michael took a slow breath. "Someone set you up." Beckett's body went rigid. "What?" Michael's gaze didn't waver. "Reese. He's the one who leaked the files." Beckett stared at him, his mind scrambling to catch up. Reese. The same man who had made it clear from day one that Beckett didn't belong here. His fists clenched. "So that's it then. You tell me this, but the damage is already done." Michael's lips twitched into something that almost resembled a smirk. "Who said the damage is done?" Beckett hesitated. Michael stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You want back in?" Beckett swallowed. "You really have to ask?" Michael nodded once. "Then listen carefully." And just like that, the trap was set. Beckett had braced himself for termination, for the cold weight of a betrayal he hadn't committed crushing him beneath its weight. Instead, Michael slid the document across the sleek mahogany desk with an unsettling calm. Beckett hesitated before picking it up, his pulse hammering as his eyes scanned the first few lines. It wasn't a severance agreement. It was an ownership stake, a seat at the table. His throat felt tight. "You still trust me?" Michael leaned back in his chair, studying him with that signature intensity, the same look that had shattered defenses on the basketball court and now ruled boardrooms with the same ruthless precision. His voice was steady, controlled, but laced with something dangerous. "I don't trust easily," Michael said, "but I know what betrayal looks like, and it ain't you." Beckett exhaled, barely processing the weight of those words before Michael reached for the remote on his desk. With a click, the large screen on the far wall came to life, playing a silent loop of security footage. And there he was, William Reese, standing in a darkened hallway, slipping a flash drive into the office server. The timestamp was unmistakable. Michael's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile, more like a predator baring its teeth. "You were set up," he said, "by a man who thought I'd cut you loose the second things got messy." Beckett clenched his fists. "So, what happens now?" Michael turned off the screen, stood, and smoothed the front of his suit. "Now?" His voice dropped, cool and sharp. "We burn it down." The boardroom was a battlefield. 12 men and women sat around the long glass table, their polished appearances masking the cutthroat instincts that had gotten them here. At the head, Michael Jordan stood like a king surveying his court. His expression gave nothing away, but the air crackled with anticipation. Beckett took his seat beside him, acutely aware of the eyes dissecting him. He had no business being here, not in their world of power plays and ruthless ambition. At least, that's what they thought. And at the far end of the table, William Reese sat with a smirk, perfectly composed. He had played the game well. He had set the trap, executed the perfect betrayal, and now he was waiting for Michael to do what he always did: cut dead weight. Michael tapped his fingers against the table, the only sound in the suffocating silence. Then he slid a folder across the smooth surface toward Reese. "Open it." Reese's smirk didn't falter as he picked it up, but the moment his eyes scanned the first page, the color drained from his face. The security footage, the server logs, every single detail of his deception laid out in black and white. Michael tilted his head. "You've been busy, Will." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Reese exhaled sharply, snapping the folder shut. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed. "Anyone could have accessed that server, and if you think I'd be stupid enough to—" Michael cut him off with a slow, deliberate nod. "You're right, you're not stupid." He leaned forward, voice lowering just enough to make the room feel smaller. "But you got arrogant. You thought I wouldn't look deeper. You thought I'd turn on Beckett without asking questions." Reese straightened, feigning confidence. "You have no proof that I—" Michael held up a hand, silencing him. Then he nodded toward Beckett. Beckett reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. He slid it across the table. "Go ahead," he said. "Play it." A tense pause. Then Michael gestured to his assistant, who plugged the drive into the room's central screen. The video played. Audio footage from a phone call. Reese's voice unmistakable. "Beckett is a liability. Jordan trusts him, and that makes him dangerous. If we get rid of him now, we can take control before he realizes what's happening." Silence. Reese's fingers twitched. His mind raced, scrambling for an escape. This could be fabricated. Michael raised an eyebrow. "You're really going to go with that?" He let the question hang in the air, then slowly, methodically stacked his hands on the table. "You thought you could buy my loyalty, but men like us, we build it." Reese swallowed. For the first time, the boardroom walls seemed to close in on him. Michael leaned back, giving him one final moment to speak, to explain, to beg. Reese did none of those things. He only stood, straightened his suit, and nodded once. "I see how it is." Michael's voice was a razor's edge. "Good, now get out." Reese turned and walked out. No outburst, no grand defense. Just the quiet understanding of a man who had lost everything in a single move. After the meeting, Beckett followed Michael into his private office. The adrenaline was still wearing off, the weight of what had just happened pressing against his chest. Michael poured himself a drink but didn't take a sip. Instead, he turned to Beckett, eyes sharp. "You know what happens next, right?" Beckett inhaled. "More wolves, more Reese types." Michael gave a slow nod. "And next time, they'll be smarter." He set the glass down and picked up the contract again, holding it out. "You still in?" Beckett hesitated. Everything in his life had been moving too fast. Just days ago, he was nothing more than a grocery store worker. Now he was standing at the edge of something massive, something that could consume him if he wasn't careful. But he looked at Michael, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes. A flicker of the same fire that had driven Beckett to help that single mother in the grocery store. Beckett reached for the contract. "I'm in." Michael smirked just slightly. "Good." Then, with a slow exhale, he turned toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing at the city skyline. His voice, when he spoke again, was softer, more reflective. "You ever wonder why I chose you?" Beckett frowned. "Because I didn't walk away when I could have?" Michael shook his head. "Because you remind me of someone." Beckett waited, but Michael didn't elaborate. He only watched the city, the weight of years pressing against his shoulders. And in that moment, Beckett understood something. This wasn't just about business. It wasn't just about loyalty or power or strategy. It was about legacy, and Michael Jordan had just made him a part of it. Beckett sat in the grand office, the weight of his new reality pressing down on him like a tailored suit that didn't quite fit yet. The city lights stretched far beyond the glass windows, a reminder of how far he had come in such a short time. Less than a month ago, he was stocking shelves, scanning groceries, and scraping by on tips from kind customers who noticed when he stayed late. Now, he was sitting in Michael Jordan's private office, an official part of his business empire. Michael sat across from him, studying Beckett with that same intense gaze that had both inspired and terrified entire generations of basketball players. But this wasn't the court, and Beckett wasn't an athlete trying to prove himself. He was something else, a wild card, a man Michael had chosen for reasons still unclear. "Still feels unreal, doesn't it?" Michael finally said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Beckett exhaled, shaking his head. "Unreal doesn't even begin to cover it." Michael smirked, setting his drink down. "It won't feel that way for long. The world moves fast at this level. You either learn to keep up, or you get left behind." Beckett tapped his fingers against the armrest, absorbing that. He knew Michael wasn't exaggerating. He had already seen how ruthless the business world could be, how quickly people like William Reese could try to tear you down the moment they saw you as a threat. "Why me?" Beckett asked, not for the first time. Michael leaned back, considering his words carefully. "Because you did something most people in power forget how to do." He gestured toward the city outside. "You looked at someone struggling and you helped them. No cameras, no PR team, just instinct." Beckett's mind flashed back to that night in the grocery store, the mother with the declining card, the hungry toddler, the quiet panic in her eyes. He hadn't thought twice about covering her bill. It had just felt like the right thing to do. Michael continued, his voice softer now. "I built everything I have from nothing, and when you come from nothing, you remember what it feels like. You don't just throw that away." His eyes darkened slightly. "But a lot of people do." Beckett absorbed that, feeling the weight of what Michael was saying. "So, what now?" he asked. Michael slid a folder across the desk. Beckett hesitated before picking it up, scanning the contents. It was an official agreement, his stake in one of Michael's private ventures. Not a test, not a probation period. A real investment in him. "You're officially at the table," Michael said. "Welcome to the deep end." The days that followed were a blur of high-stakes meetings, power plays, and whispered conversations in hallways. Beckett quickly learned that business at this level wasn't just about numbers. It was about navigating egos, dodging traps, and learning when to speak and when to stay silent. Michael didn't hold his hand, but he didn't let him drown either. He threw Beckett into situations where he had to think fast, make decisions, and prove that he wasn't just some grocery store worker who got lucky. Some board members welcomed him with forced smiles, their eyes betraying their doubts. Others, especially those loyal to Reese, made it clear they didn't believe he belonged here. "You must be the charity case," one of them, a sharp-suited man named Elliot Vaughn, said at a private dinner event. Beckett didn't flinch. He met Elliot's gaze and smiled. "Funny, I was just thinking the same about you." A few chuckles echoed around the table. Elliot's smile faltered just slightly. Michael, sitting at the head, didn't interfere, but there was the faintest trace of amusement in his expression. Beckett was learning. Fast. Despite the whirlwind of his new life, one thing remained at the back of his mind: the woman from the grocery store. He had no idea who she was, no way of knowing if she was okay, if that small moment of kindness had even made a difference. But he knew there were thousands like her. People who worked just as hard, who fought just as much, but who would never get a lucky break like he had. And that didn't sit right with him. So he did something about it. With Michael's guidance, Beckett set up a foundation, one designed to help struggling single mothers get back on their feet. Financial aid, job training, childcare support, real, tangible help. It started small, just a few families, a few success stories. But word spread quickly, and soon, the foundation was making real waves. One evening, Michael found Beckett in his office, buried in paperwork for the foundation. "You know, you don't have to do this," Michael said, leaning against the doorway. Beckett looked up, tired but resolute. "I do, though." Michael studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Good," he said simply. Then, with a smirk, he added, "Just don't let it distract you from keeping your seat at the table. They'll use anything they can to push you out." Beckett grinned. "Let them try." Michael chuckled. "Now you're starting to sound like me." Months passed. Beckett grew into his role, no longer just surviving in this world but making his mark on it. The foundation flourished. His reputation solidified. And slowly the whispers of doubt in boardrooms and private meetings began to fade. One night, Michael and Beckett stood on the rooftop of the office building, watching the city stretch out below them. "You've done good," Michael admitted. Beckett smirked. "High praise." Michael chuckled, but his expression turned serious. "This world will never stop testing you. No matter how much you prove yourself, someone will always be waiting for you to slip." Beckett nodded, already knowing that to be true. Michael looked at him, something unreadable in his expression. "You remind me of someone I used to know." Beckett frowned. "Who?" Michael exhaled, then just shook his head. "Doesn't matter." They stood in silence for a while, the city humming beneath them. For the first time in a long time, Beckett felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. But deep down, he also knew. This was only the beginning. The soft chime of the grocery store's entrance bell barely registered in Beckett's mind as he stepped inside. The scent of fresh produce, the hum of fluorescent lights, the quiet murmur of conversations. It was all familiar, yet distant, like a memory from another lifetime. Years had passed since he last stood in a place like this as anything other than a customer. Now, his suits were custom-tailored, his wristwatch worth more than his first apartment, and his name carried weight in rooms he never imagined entering. But no matter how much power he accumulated, some things never changed, like the sight in front of him. Near the checkout lanes, a young employee, probably no older than 20, was crouched down, carefully repacking a bag for an elderly man whose hands trembled slightly as he tried to steady himself against the counter. The employee didn't look annoyed, didn't rush. Instead, he spoke softly, reassuring the man with a quiet patience Beckett recognized all too well. It was like looking into a mirror. Beckett exhaled, something tightening in his chest. He had been that kid once, standing in this exact kind of store, making the kind of choices that didn't seem like much at the time but ended up changing everything. As he moved toward the exit, he caught the young worker's eye and nodded. A simple acknowledgement. A silent respect. The kid hesitated, then nodded back. Beckett stepped outside, the crisp night air cooling the warmth of nostalgia settling over him. He had no idea why the moment lingered so strongly, why it felt significant. But that feeling, the one deep in his gut that had never steered him wrong, told him something was coming. He just didn't expect it to arrive so soon. Later that night, Beckett returned to his penthouse, exhaustion pressing against his shoulders. Deals, board meetings, negotiations. His world never slowed down. He tossed his keys onto the counter, already loosening his tie when he saw it. An envelope. Black, sleek, tucked just beneath his door. No name, just an address. Beckett stared at it. For a long moment, a slow grin spreading across his face. He shook his head, chuckling under his breath. Damn it, Michael. The address led him to a private lounge on the top floor of an upscale Chicago high-rise. The kind of place where powerful men whispered over expensive scotch, where the air buzzed with deals made in shadows. The hostess at the entrance took one look at the envelope in his hand and nodded. He's waiting for you. Of course he was. Beckett walked through the dimly lit space, the city's skyline stretching wide beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. And there, sitting at a table near the glass, was Michael Jordan, the legend himself. Older now, but still carrying the same presence that made the world hold its breath when he stepped onto the court. His sharp eyes lifted as Beckett approached, a knowing smirk already playing at his lips. You took your time, Michael said, swirling the drink in his hand. Beckett sat across from him, leaning back in his chair. You knew I'd come. Michael shrugged. Of course. You're predictable. Beckett chuckled. Funny. I was just about to say the same about you. Michael's smirk deepened, but he didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied Beckett, as if searching for something beneath the surface. Finally, he leaned forward, setting his glass down with deliberate care. So, Michael said, voice dropping into that familiar tone that always carried something deeper than what was being said. Tell me what you saw today. Beckett didn't have to ask what he meant. He exhaled, resting his hands on the table. A kid, working a shift, helping someone when he didn't have to. Michael nodded, slow and approving. And? Beckett frowned slightly. And what? Michael tilted his head. And what did you do? Beckett hesitated, replaying the moment in his head. I nodded at him. Michael raised an eyebrow. That's it? Beckett's frown deepened. What else was I supposed to do? Michael leaned back, studying him again. Then he sighed and shook his head. You really don't get it, do you? Beckett folded his arms. Enlighten me. Michael's voice was quieter now, but there was a sharpness beneath it. Years ago, I saw you do something simple, something small, something no one else noticed. He paused. And it changed everything. Beckett said nothing. He didn't have to. Michael gestured toward the city outside. You've built something, Beckett. You've climbed higher than most men ever will, and that's good. But the real test isn't just surviving up here. He tapped a finger against the table. It's what you do with the power once you have it. Beckett inhaled slowly. I started a foundation. I help people. Michael cut him off. That's not what I mean. A beat of silence stretched between them. Then Michael leaned in. "You nodded at that kid today. And sure, maybe he'll remember it. Maybe he won't. But you had the chance to do for him what I did for you." His gaze hardened. "And you didn't." Beckett's stomach twisted, but he didn't let it show. He sat back, choosing his next words carefully. "You're saying I should have offered him something? Given him a job?" Michael's expression didn't waver. "I'm saying you should have paid attention." Beckett exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. He hadn't thought about it like that. Michael smirked slightly, sensing the shift. "See, the thing about power? It's only worth something if you pass it on." He gestured toward the city. "I didn't bring you in just to make you rich. I brought you in because I saw something worth building." He let that sink in before adding, "So, what are you building, Beckett?" Beckett stared at him, the weight of the question settling deep. What was he building? He had spent years proving himself, years fighting to keep his place, to hold his ground against men who wanted to push him out. But maybe, just maybe, he had been so focused on keeping his seat at the table that he hadn't thought about who he was saving a seat for. Michael watched him carefully, then nodded, satisfied. "You'll figure it out," he said, leaning back. "And when you do?" A smirk. "You'll know where to find me." Beckett chuckled, shaking his head. "Damn it, Michael." Michael raised his glass in a silent toast. "That's the second time you've said that tonight. I must be doing something right." Beckett exhaled, a slow smile tugging at his lips. The final test wasn't about proving himself to Michael. It never was. It was about proving to himself that he had learned what truly mattered. And now, it was time to act on it. This wasn't the first time he had been summoned like this. No warning, no details, just a time and place that Michael expected him to show up at. And, like always, Beckett came. Across the room, Michael Jordan sat at his usual table, a quiet storm of presence even now, older but no less sharp. His suit was crisp, his expression unreadable, but the moment he looked up and saw Beckett, a knowing smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "You thought I'd let you get soft," Michael said, his voice carrying the same effortless authority that had once commanded stadiums. Beckett exhaled, shaking his head as he took the seat across from him. "You're testing me now?" Michael leaned back in his chair, swirling the dark liquid in his glass as he watched the city beyond the windows. "Always." The weight of that single word settled between them, thick with unspoken meaning. Beckett had spent years proving himself, first to Michael, then to the business world, and finally to himself. He had built his reputation, carved his place at the table, and fought off the wolves that had tried to drag him down. But Michael had never truly stopped watching, never stopped pushing. And Beckett understood why. Michael didn't believe in comfort. He didn't believe in safety. He believed in survival, in resilience, in the kind of legacy that wasn't just written in contracts or bank statements, but in the people who carried it forward. Beckett took a slow breath. "So, what is this? Another lesson? Another game?" Michael chuckled, low and deep. "It's whatever you want it to be." He gestured toward the city. "You've built something, Beckett. But the question is, what now?" Beckett studied him, searching for the meaning beneath the words. Michael had never been one to say things plainly. He spoke in challenges, in unspoken expectations. "You already know what I'm doing," Beckett said. "The foundation, the investments. I'm not just sitting back." Michael nodded, but there was something else in his gaze. "That's good, but that's not what I'm asking." He leaned forward slightly, voice lowering. "What do you see when you look at all of this?" Beckett followed his gaze to the skyline, the towering buildings standing as symbols of power, ambition, and everything in between. "I see the same city I always have," Beckett said. Michael tilted his head. "Do you?" Beckett hesitated. Michael let the silence hang for a moment before continuing. "The problem with getting to the top is that it's easy to forget what it felt like at the bottom. He tapped his fingers against the glass. "You still remember?" Beckett's jaw tightened. "Of course I do." Michael studied him carefully, then gave a small nod. "Good. Then prove it." Beckett narrowed his eyes. "How?" Michael smirked again, this time with something heavier beneath it. "That's not my job to answer anymore." He leaned back. "You're part of the story now. Make sure it's worth telling." Beckett exhaled, shaking his head. "You always do this," he muttered. Michael raised an eyebrow. "Do what?" Beckett gestured toward him. "You talk in riddles. Make me figure it out on my own." Michael chuckled, taking a sip of his drink. "And yet, you always do." Days passed, but Michael's words stayed with him. Beckett found himself looking at things differently, at meetings, at business deals, at the way power moved through the city. He had spent so much time securing his place, making sure he was untouchable, that he had almost forgotten the reason he started all of this in the first place. The foundation was growing. His influence was spreading. But was he building something, or just maintaining what already existed? The question haunted him. One night, he drove back to the grocery store where everything had started. He sat in the parking lot watching the late-night workers stocking shelves, the tired customers moving through the aisles. He remembered what it felt like to stand behind that counter, unseen and underestimated. To feel like no one in the world gave a damn whether he made it or not. And then he thought about that young worker he had seen not long ago, the one who reminded him of himself. Michael was right. He had nodded, and then walked away. That wasn't enough. The next morning, Beckett made a call. Within a week, the grocery store chain where he once worked had a new program in place. A quiet initiative, not for headlines or praise, but for impact. Tuition assistance, career mentorship, real pathways for employees who wanted more but didn't have the means to chase it. It wasn't charity. It was opportunity. The same thing Michael had given him. And when the first group of workers was selected for the program, Beckett made sure to be there. He stood at the back of the small break room as the store manager explained the new initiative, watching the faces of the employees shift from skepticism to hope. Then his eyes landed on a familiar face. The young worker from before, the one who had helped the elderly man that night, stood near the front, listening intently. When the meeting ended, Beckett approached him. "You going to apply?" Beckett asked. The worker hesitated. I don't know if I'd even get in." Beckett smirked. "Neither did I." The kid frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Beckett extended his hand. "Beckett Rhodes." The worker's eyes widened slightly as recognition dawned. He shook Beckett's hand, still looking uncertain. Beckett studied him for a moment. "You ever hear the story about the guy who covered a single mother's grocery bill?" The worker blinked. "Yeah, I think so." Beckett smiled slightly. "Funny thing about small moments," he said. "They have a way of leading to something bigger." The worker didn't respond right away, but something shifted in his expression. The kind of shift that meant a seed had been planted. Beckett clapped him on the shoulder. "Apply." Then, after a beat, he added, "And when you make it, don't forget to do the same for someone else." The worker nodded, something resolute in his eyes now. Beckett turned to leave, but before he stepped outside, he pulled out his phone. A single text. "To Michael Jordan. I get it now." Seconds later, a response came through. "Michael, took you long enough." Beckett shook his head, laughing quietly to himself. Michael had passed the torch, but it was up to Beckett to keep it burning. Some opportunities change lives. Some decisions define legacies. If one small act of kindness could rewrite your future, would you take the risk? Power isn't about wealth. It's about what you do with it. Because the real question isn't who's at the table. It's who you're bringing with you,